Hey everybody, what's going on? I'm DJ Sixsmith. Welcome to Sit Down. Robert P. Jones here with us. White Too Long, his brand new book, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Robbie, how are you, man?
I'm good. Good. Thanks for having me on.
You got it. So you are somebody that has studied religion for a long time. You obviously have been involved in Christianity for a long time. I would imagine that diving into this topic, and especially white supremacy in Christianity, is certainly a lot. What was it like writing the book?
Well, as you can see, I'm white, and I've grown up, Christian, and so this is a very personal book. I mean, in my day job, I usually have on my social scientist hat, and I'm looking at data and trying to give the best objective interpretation of the data that I can. And certainly, this book is also based on some of that data, but I think it also is personal. And so I think. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi as a Southern Baptist. So in the white evangelical world, I have a degree from a Southern Baptist college. I have a Master of Divinity degree from a Southern Baptist seminary. So I've drank fairly deeply at this well, and it was really my own experience growing up. So what I tried to do is take that experience as well as what the social science data is telling us, and put it together into kind of one story. But I'm very much, in the story. The first sentence of the book has the word I in it. The last sentence of the book has the word us in it. So again, pretty much looking at the data and kind of working back and forth between history, data, and my own personal story in the book.
I think that's why it resonated with me so much, is that you're willing to look at your own personal history, family history, you go into the data, and also you redefine a lot of really interesting things. Even just talking about what white supremacy looks like. It's not just the KKK. It's not people going around in hoods. Like, it's a lot of the stuff that we see in our everyday lives that for us as white men, like, that is the status quo. So what was it like just redefining that term specifically?
Yeah, that term, is often, I think, when especially white people hear that term, they react against it, or they think, oh, that's just the, people in hoods who lynch people and are the perpetrators of racial violence. But that's not really, I think, the more pernicious form of white supremacy is really the more banal type that is with us all the time. And so even if, for me, like I had to do some work kind of thinking about that, but even if you just flip the words around, right, from white supremacy to the supremacy of whites, and you think about what that means, and it really doesn't mean harboring personal hatred towards someone who's Black. I mean, what it means is being okay with and supporting society being set up in a way that advantages white people at the expense of Black and brown people. And for most of American history, I mean, that is exactly the way that society's been set up. It's been set up by laws, sort of our politics, our culture, everything from who could get what jobs to who could live in what neighborhood, to who could vote. I mean, all of these things have really been shaped by white supremacy. And I think the institution, though, that has gotten not enough scrutiny are white Christian churches. I mean, those churches were the chief legitimizers of that worldview, really throughout American history. So I'm partly just trying to really cast a light on something that's fairly plain, really, and what does that mean, really, for us today?
And it's something that's been known for a long time. I mean, generations. You go back to the days of the Confederacy and Jefferson Davis, and there are Christian leaders side by side with him at that time. What did you learn about this? Because a lot of people know this history. A lot of people may not have looked at this as closely as you have. So what really piqued your interest here?
Well, as I've talked to other white Christians, I mean, one response that I commonly get is, I had no idea. That's a very common response. And I have to say that really has been my own experience as well. I mean, like I said, I grew up, steeped in this white evangelical world. And I was that kid. I was at church 5 times a week. I mean, I was there all the time, and active in the youth group, even in my adolescent years. Not once did I hear a sermon about civil rights, about racial justice, or certainly not about white Christian complicity in blessing and legitimizing that world. And so, I think it is this kind of gradual sense of, and I was in my 20s before I realized that the Genesis story of my own denomination, like, I didn't even know the true history of my own denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, that it was actually formed in 1845 explicitly to allow missionaries to be appointed who owned slaves. Like that was the issue. That was the split between Northern and Southern Baptists. And the Northern Baptists said, we don't think it's appropriate to appoint missionaries that hold slaves. And the Southern churches said, well, we disagree, split off, form their own denomination. And that denomination eventually becomes the largest Protestant denomination in the country by the middle of the 20th century. It's the one that I grew up in. But that history and that origin story, the genesis of my own denomination, I didn't hear that story until I was in my 20s in seminary.
And there's still a lot of churches that don't go back. And you mentioned a ton of churches that have reckoned with the past and have been forced to confront racism, specifically when it came to the Charleston shooting with Dylan Roof, and especially this year with George Floyd. So what does it look like now in terms of some of the churches that are making progress and then others that are just kind of have their heads buried in the sand? You know, what are you thinking about when it comes to those situations?
Yeah, well, I think we're very much at the beginning of these stories being told with any honesty among white Christians, and it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book was really to, I think if I have some hopes about the book within white Christian churches, it is that it'll serve as a catalyst for these kinds of honest conversations to finally happen. I do because it follows my personal story. I talk about two Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia, which is where both of my parents are from, and actually 6 generations of my family go back to Macon, Georgia. And there are 2 First Baptist churches in Macon, one white, one black. They used to be the same church going back to the 1820s, and the history of those 2 churches, and this is fairly common across the South particularly, was that it was white slave owners bringing enslaved people to church with them. Whites would sit in the front, enslaved African Americans sitting in the back, and that was the kind of early seedbed of white Christianity. Was in this place where not only was slavery tolerated, but it was actually seen as part of God's plan for how human society should properly be set up. And so we had but there are these 2 churches that have done some remarkable community building over the last 5 years. But I think the thing is, it's been slow. It's been unsteady, and it's been, I think, particularly for the white churches, for the white church there has required a lot of soul searching. Like, for example, they found once they really started digging and looking at the history, they found this really heartbreaking thing in the accounting ledger where the church was having trouble paying the pastor's salary and paying off its building, and they actually sold one of the members. Sold some of their slaves to pay the pastor's salary and to pay the church bills, which would have required separating families, and it just kind of goes by, right, as in an accounting ledger without much reflection at all. And so I think facing that kind of history, and then thinking hard about how that legacy is still with us today, I think is still the project, but it's barely getting started. The churches having these conversations are very few and far between.
I think it's really interesting because, just full disclosure, I'm a Christian and I grew up Catholic, and it's something that's a little bit more recent in my life. And there's areas that Christians are willing to dive into. There are people that Christians are willing to help no matter what the situation. But when it becomes uncomfortable for white Christians, it's like we can just kind of opt out because of the color of our skin. And that's not the case for brown and black people. So what's it been like having conversations about this? Because I would imagine that some white Christians are open and honest and authentic, and others just don't acknowledge it. So what have the past couple of months been like for you, and especially now that your book's been out? What's happened?
Yeah, well, I've had even conversations with my own family. It says that I deliberately didn't share the manuscript with my parents until it was done. I just kind of wanted to make sure that I had written it the way I wanted to write it. But one of the things happened even when I shared it with my parents. Some other stories came out. For example, I write in the book about how as late as the 1960s, white deacons would kind of be stationed outside of white Christian churches to prevent black people from coming to church, right? From integrating a white Christian service. And found out, for example, that my grandfather was one of those folks, that he was a deacon, ex-Navy guy, and stood out there on the church to kind of make sure that the church service would remain white and remain segregated. So I think it's really about telling stories and telling true stories. That's I think what's hopeful about it. Of course, there's a lot of defensiveness. But one of the things I've just been trying to encourage, myself and others, is that when that defensiveness comes up, especially if it comes up pretty hot and heavy, that's a clue, right? It's a clue that we should be paying attention. So what's going on? Why is it so hot? Why is it so heavy? What's it resisting? And just sitting with that, I think, long enough is like, one key to kind of helping take a next step, kind of getting past that initial defensive reaction. I mean, what many white Christians think of themselves as good people who do good things. That's exactly what one of the people in this in the white church in Macon said. And yet, that's part of the truth, but it's not the whole truth. And so I think, taking the time to really sit with that discomfort and let the stories come. If you'll sit with the discomfort, I think a little, the vista opens up a little bit more, the lens opens up a bit more, that I think it creates a space for more truth to be told. One other comment I should make is that we talked a lot about white evangelical churches because that's sort of my background. But one of the things the book makes clear is that this is not just a Southern white evangelical problem. What the current public opinion data shows is that holding racist attitudes are strongly correlated with not just white evangelical identity, but white mainline Protestant identity. That is the groups that are more predominant in the Midwest and the Northeast, like Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and white Catholics. That is really true across all white Christian subgroups. And I think that's also something that is maybe quite surprising to folks, that this isn't just a former states of the Confederacy problem. This is much broader than that.
Yeah, this is happening all over the place, and your data clearly lays it out. And I think another really interesting part of this is that you have a lot of people in these circles that live their lives by the word, by scripture, by the Bible, and aren't necessarily fully of the world. And then you have those people that are kind of bridging the gap between the two. So what's it like kind of thinking about that situation? Because so many people do live their lives by God's will and God's plan and aren't really necessarily thinking about what's going on. How are people reckoning with that? Because they can't avoid what's happening right now, yet they can kind of just focus on what's always been. So what was it like thinking about some of those concepts?
Yeah, well, it kind of led me into the world of theology, really. I have a whole chapter in the book about believing and the theology of white supremacy. And one of the challenges, I think, for white Christians is that, and this is, again, true across the evangelical mainline and Catholic circles, is that part of what's happened is perhaps not surprising given the environment in which, white Christianity across the board grew up. And that is not only tolerating, but seeing things like white supremacy and slavery as compatible with Christianity. And so even after the Civil War, slavery, fades from the scene, but white supremacy does not. White supremacy survives the Civil War intact. And so I think kind of hanging on to that insight and is, I think, one of the key things for understanding where we are today.
Like, these are conversations that weren't happening a few years ago. So what's most encouraging to you as we move forward here?
Yeah. Well, one more point on the last question you asked is, I do think this idea, one of the things that has been so central, particularly to evangelical Christianity, but also for other branches, is this idea that Christianity is centered around a personal relationship with Jesus. But, if you think sociologically about how that has functioned, it is one of the, I think, unfortunate things that way of thinking about Christianity has done, is that it has really screened out questions of social justice and racial justice from what it means to be properly Christian. In other words, one could have a kind of warm, internal, spiritual connection with Jesus, and the way that white Christianity has been set up, that is completely disconnected from any questions of justice outside the church. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from Birmingham jail, I think, put it so starkly. And when he was wondering, like, what's going on? Like, why aren't all of these good white Christians rising up and joining the civil rights movement and the movement for Black equality? And he ended up reflecting, and the image he used is of white Christians sitting behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows, right? And that the function really of this kind of, particularly this, I think, hyper individualistic way of thinking about a personal relationship with Jesus, it does sort of allow you to sort of feel like you were being properly Christian and completely disconnected from issues of racial justice and racial inequality, to the extent that people could feel very much like they're in the mainstream and have a good relationship with God. At the same time, they're resisting segregation, supporting slavery, all the way through American history. So, and the other question you asked was what?
Just how, well, first of all, I think that's a great point, because you have so many people that say, I'm a good person, I have this relationship with Jesus, and I'm helping out in my community, but I'm not focused on all these different things. And then I think the larger point is that we are starting to have these conversations about race and about gay marriage and about even gender roles in the church. And we weren't necessarily having those conversations.
Yep.
You document the museums that are now popping up in Mississippi and other places around the country. Like, there is some movement. So what is most encouraging at this moment for you when it comes to the conversation around white supremacy?
Yeah.
Christianity?
Well, you know, again, I think what's encouraging is, books have they're a slow moving train, right? So I started working on this book more than 2 years ago, and turned in the final manuscript last fall. And when I turned in the manuscript last fall, I could not really have imagined the moment that we're in right now, you know. And so some of the things that I think are hopeful, almost a year ago last year, I was in Richmond doing research for the book, and I walked the length of Monument Avenue in Richmond. And if you walk that, just like 14 blocks, but you pass 5 massive statues and memorials to Confederate leaders, in Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy. But today, those 4 of the 5 of the bronze statues of those memorials have been removed. And the last one to Robert E. Lee is scheduled for removal. So, you know, I would not have guessed that we'd see that kind of movement. I mean, those statues have been there for more than 100 years. They were put there between 1890 and 1920. And they've just stood there all this time, you know, through the civil rights movement, through all of it. The other thing I'd point to is from my home state of Mississippi. Another thing I would not have anticipated is that the state of Mississippi, the legislature voted to remove the Confederate battle flag from the state flag, which is the last state to carry that symbol in it. And moreover, it wasn't just the legislature, but before the legislature voted, the Mississippi Baptist Convention, which is the state arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, actually held a press conference and called on the legislature and the governor to remove the flag. Is something that Mississippi Baptists were behind. So when I see those kinds of things, I do see some things changing. I do think we're at a real moment of reckoning here. But I think the test for the kind of future success and really the test of authenticity for white Christians is whether it moves beyond kind of just removing some symbols, apologies, and lament for the way that the past went, and if it moves toward real concrete work that's about repair and restitution. Like, so all, you know, hundreds of years of discrimination against African Americans can't be undone with an apology. And the one thing that I think white Christians want to do is kind of move from lament and apology to straight to reconciliation. And so in the book I write about, you know, that I really think white Christians should really stop talking about reconciliation and just talk about racial justice, repair, and restitution. And if they talk about that long enough and they do stuff in that space long enough, reconciliation will come as an organic outgrowth of that work. But it's not something I think white Christians should be reaching for directly. It's kind of a shortcut that skips the important work of justice.
Yeah, and you mentioned it right there, just doing the work, because it's very easy to forgive, and it's a religion full of reconciliation and forgiveness, but this has to be a lifestyle going forward. And I think that's a big conversation we're having now, is that there's been all this momentum when it comes to the conversations about racial injustice, the conversations about white supremacy, but does it last beyond 2020? Is this going to be the work going forward? Like, it's clearly been your life. You've had these conversations for a long time, but I think that's one of the biggest questions for everybody right now, is that, can we continue this momentum?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think the proof is in the pudding. You know, I mean, it's easy to apologize. It's even easy to get behind the removal of a symbol, but you know, I mean, even if you take a kind of internal Christian theological view of this, true repentance, you know, in Christian theology is never just about saying you're sorry. You know, the Bible's pretty clear about this, that even explicitly says, you know, look, if you've got something between you and your brother, don't come to the altar to worship. You know, go and make it right with your brother. And that, again, involves more than just saying you're sorry, but it involves repair, restitution, and really thinking about accountability and justice issues. That's a long road. And I think what we're yet to see, I think, is whether white Christians will, take that work up. One last word, though, on this is that I don't think this is, and this is something I think that came to me late and in realization, and I think is not quite as clear among many white Christians that I talk to, is that white Christians, ourselves, we have something at stake here. It's not just about making it right. I mean, that's certainly important. That external work is important. But if you really care about the future of the faith, you really have to think about what are we going to pass down to our children and grandchildren? What kind of Christianity are we going to pass down? And I think what has happened, is that white supremacy has been really built into the DNA of white Christianity because of its history. And the only way that it doesn't continue to get passed down is by real work in the current generation. So we have something at stake, I think, in sort of thinking about how our faith and our understanding of Christianity has been really disfigured by this kind of sinister presence that we have allowed to stay within the walls of the church and inside the pages of our theology.
Well said, Robbie. Book was great. White Too Long, and hopefully when people look up you generations from now and your family, they'll think of somebody that spoke truth to power. Thanks so much for jumping on. Really appreciate it.
Well, yeah, wishing that back to you as well. Thanks so much.